Thank you, Daniel. Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with Edmond Becquerel himself. Let's discuss his minute work, experimenting with the facts and the methodologies and the scientific experiments. Let's describe his qualities. I'm looking forward to hearing Ms. Christine Blondel. She's a historian at the CNRS Center, and she authored a bibliography of Edmond Becquerel, which is quite the authoritative source. Ms. Blondel, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Yes, I'm here to talk about Edmond Becquerel. He provides a perfect interface between science and industry. That'll be one of the highlights of my presentation. I'm retired from the CNRS Center, and in recent years I worked on a site. I don't know whether you can see it. Probably not. I would need to share my screen, wouldn't I? Can you see my PowerPoint? We're getting there. Wonderful. Okay, can you see it in full screen? Technology works in that grant. Okay, so you see the link on the screen, and here you will find a history of electricity all the way from the 16th century until the early 20th century. Oh darn, this doesn't work. Perfect. Thank you. Many thanks to Daniel Lampestarders. I met with him. I met him actually through the Coopérative Solaire Citoyenne Sud Paris Soleil effort, and he has become instrumental in our efforts. See the commemorative plaque that we plastered on the wall of the museum. We've organized an international colloquium, we have publications. So why can we say that Edmond Becquerel became the founding father of photovoltaics? Well, let's look back a little bit. This is a Wikipedia page from 2006 on Edmond Becquerel. As you can see, there is a single sentence. He collaborated with his father on a number of publications. His son is Henry Becquerel. So his son is even more famous than the father because he discovered radioactivity alongside the Curie. And he's one of those who hasn't been associated with a major experiment. In 1994, when I wrote a bio for the dictionary, there was pretty much nothing on him published in the 20th century. So, if we look at this Wikipedia page, in 2019, it has his own Wikipedia page with his bio, with his picture. The first sentence says, in 1839, he discovered the photovoltaic effect. That is the emergence of a voltage at the electrodes of a semiconductor material exposed to light. You can spend some time on this first sentence, but I would like to say here is that in this page, you will find a full bio in particular. So he was born in 1820. That's what we can add. He was admitted into ENS as well as a Polytechnic. He's an assistant at the museum. He was the president of the Science Academy, etc., etc. So how do we explain this difference between 2006 and the end of the 20th century and the more recent period? So getting back to this first sentence, he discovered the photovoltaic effect in 1839 in a semiconductive material. I have a question I want to ask. Now, in terms of the history of science, how do you attribute a scientific discovery to one man? Can you actually attribute it to a single man? I need to say a few words about his father, Antoine Caesar, because he owes his father a lot. He was a leading member of the French scientific community, a member of the Academy of Science. He worked with Ampère, with Jean-Baptiste Biot. He had an excellent lab at the museum. He specialized in electricity, particularly electrochemistry, and he was a great experimenter. In particular, he devised an experiment which was much more important, the constant current battery in the 19th century. And this became actionable thanks to uh, Daniel. And now it's called the Daniel battery, but originally it was Becquerel who invented it. So he works in his father's lab starting age 18. He was admitted into Polytechnic school, but he resigned right away and joined his father in his lab. So, see the picture on the screen? This device was used by Edmond to show the photovoltaic effect. This is the tank of the constant current battery designed by his father. So he used his father's equipment. What is the definition of what is discovered? What is the definition of a quote unquote discovery? So, 1839, that's when the discovery takes place. But the definition is the creation of a current or electric tension, electric current under the action of light. And Becquerel did observe electric current between two metal plates bathed in an acid solution when one of the plates is exposed to light. But his objective was not to use light to create electricity. He wanted to quantify the action of light rays thanks to the chemical effect. And this chemical effect can be measured using electric current. So he did obtain an electrical current, but it was short. The duration was short. We wanted to study the variability of the current depending on the color of the light used using different colored filters. However, because we are here to celebrate Becquerel, I would like to support this attribution to him of the photovoltaic effect. This is a quote from his treatise. This a device called an electrochemical actinometer is to active radiation on light sensitive substances is to this radiation what the thermal electric battery is relative to calorific or heat rays. So this is an explicit comparison between the actinometer designed to measure the chemical action to the thermal electric battery. So this sentence shows that he was aware that something resembling a battery could actually generate a current. But the other speakers can say this better than I can. So let me say a few words about why this is interesting. The goal was to show how difficult some of his experiments were. Becquerel, Foucault, Coulomb, Fizeau all carried out very difficult experiments. What is hard to achieve is accuracy, and the submissions and the following memoirs don't talk about how difficult those experiments were to organize. And it's difficult for historians to get that idea from the sources they have available to them. So how was this discovery disseminated, recognized, and integrated into the body of science? As already suggested, this phenomenon was undiscovered for over a century. The actinometer itself, as an instrument for measuring light rays, was underused. Otherwise, we need to switch to 1887 Hertz, and then we can jump all the way to the 1950s. So it was in the 1980s that things changed. Could the speaker please use a headphones? The sound comes and goes. This is horrible for the interpreters. 1889, the 150th anniversary of Becquerel's memoir. Then emerged the Becquerel Prize. That's when it was created. I believe that this prize would emerge in the end of the 20th century marks a turn in the ways in which the work of Edmond Becquerel was evaluated. Christine, apologies. would it be possible for you to speak closer to the microphone? Ah, my computer is old. The interpreter can barely hear what you're saying. You need to wear headphones with a built-in microphone. Many thanks in advance. I will try to speak up, says Christine Bondrin. So the cultural background. The daguerreotype was all the rage. Arago made the announcement to the Academy in 1839. See the audience lining up so they could get their picture taken using the daguerreotype technique. This is a technique that was developed by Daguerre, but this was also a challenge for physicists. Now we know how the daguerreotype works. You expose plates to light for about 20 minutes. So Edmond Becquerel was encouraged by Arago to work on this, and he worked together with Daguerre on these plates. Clearly, what was his motivation? He wanted to improve on the daguerreotype process. I will now. I'm not going to go through every single family member who worked at the museum and who worked at the Science Academy, but they all worked in the same areas. Electricity, magnetism, light, phosphorescence. A quick reminder, Edmond Becquerel's father, Antoine Caesar, got him hired. He got the leadership of the museum to hire him as an assistant as soon as he was out of preparatory school. So in 1838, he came out of the prep school and published a memorandum soon after. So each member of the Becquerel family hired his own son as an assistant. They all did it. So it was a father and son affair for 4 generations. Now, I'd like to get back of continuity, institutional continuity. There is institutional continuity, but is there intellectual continuity between the different generations, at least between the first 3 generations? As already emphasized, the operative word here is experimental. Physics here is experimental. It's not at all theoretical. It is not based on the verification of theoretical laws. They're not looking for theoretical laws. They don't use mathematics, or not a lot. In the experimental treatise for electricity and magnetism, Antoine César Becquerel. So when I say Mr. Becquerel, I'm referring to the father, Becquerel Sr. He said, in general, theories come and go, only the facts remain. As much as possible, I avoided introducing calculations. However, this type of physics is highly descriptive. It emphasizes new instruments, new experiments, it explores new phenomena. Antoine César Becquerel Sr. Masters very tricky instruments, for example, the Coulomb scale. He invents instruments such as an electrometer or the differential galvanometer. And the second operative word here is applied physics. This is an obsolete term. It's no longer in use, but it has to do with the relationship between physics on the one hand and industry on the other. So this is a joint treatise written by father and son in the 1850s. And this clearly states electricity, magnetism, and their applications in physics, arts, and industry. There's another treatise on other applications. Antoine César Becquerel Sr. Worked on the protecting iron ships from corrosion. The sun comes and goes, the interpreter can't hear. The speaker needs to wear headphones with a built-in microphone. Thank you. So the discoveries of the Becquerel family translated into important applications for industry. So electroplating in particular, and there are other industry issues that were addressed. for example, industrial batteries and the first electric motors. Ms. Blondel, would it be possible for you to wear headphones with a built-in microphone? The sound is choppy. We can barely hear you. Can you hear me better? I can hear you. Can you hear me now? Much better. Thank you so much. Now, getting back to the scientific activity of Edmond Becquerel. First, the actinometer, but I already touched upon that. So, the other speaker will discuss that at great length. So, moving on, I'd also like to discuss color photography of the solar spectrum. This is something the other speakers will also discuss. Phosphorescence. He invented the phosphoroscope. This is the instrument in the lower right-hand corner of the slide. This device made it possible to measure durations lower than 10,000th of a second. Now, these types of glassware were very popular at that time because the glassware incorporated uranium salts and therefore glowed in the dark. So, thermoelectricity, conductivity of gas and liquids. Becquerel also studied another phenomenon having to do with electrical current being created in a liquid. But these are phenomena that have been forgotten from history, unfortunately. And also thermoelectricity, measuring high temperatures, the influence of electricity on plants, because he worked in a museum. And so he also looked at the role played by electricity in living bodies and magnetism as well. But I'll be quick here. There was a controversy with Faraday regarding diamagnetism and paramagnetism. So he worked in a wide variety of different fields, but there was always a relationship between physics, electricity, chemistry, and the light. So he had an exploratory approach. He didn't believe in theory. What he tried to do is quantify the phenomenon. Here's a very important point in terms of the development of science, and science historians have emphasized this at great length. The role played by education, the role played by schools of thought, a professor surrounded by his disciples, and Edmond Becquerel played a really important part. He taught at the museum. He didn't have much of an audience, very few students. However, when he taught at the Conservatoire, the Conservatory of Arts and Crafts, his classes were extremely successful. Some years, more than 600 students showed up in the lecture hall to listen to his class. Why? Well, because the second half of the 19th century was when electricity emerged. So, the beginnings of electric lighting, electric arc, the first electric motors, etc., etc. So industrialization, this is a new science. At the time, it was the equivalent of today's state-of-the-art science. And so everybody was interested, not just the scientists, artisans, craftsmen, industry player, the general public came to find out more about these latest discoveries. So his class was instrumental in disseminating these techniques, and his treatise was instrumental as well. So much about teaching. What about his work at the lab? His lab was open to industrial and medical applications. several assistants came to help, including Gaston Planté, who invented the lead battery. But there are other assistants who perform measurements on dynamos, electrical motors, who worked on the World Expos at the time in the electricity section. So science was disseminated around Becquerel and his team of assistants working together in the lab. Now, the prefect of police in Paris had to step in to limit the number of patients admitted into the laboratory because they came to get electrical therapy. And there were so many of them, the police prefect had to step in. So, see the crowded lecture hall on this picture. This, you see the big table with all of the instruments on top. This picture was taken using electrical lighting, according to the caption. Now, a few more words about his class at the conservatory. At the end of his life, around 1880, his applied physics class was deemed as insufficient because industrial electricity was all the rage. Edison, Westinghouse, and also the electricity company in France. His course was considered as insufficient. It hadn't kept up with the times, and it is then that the industrial electricity chair was created. But until the 1870s, he really was in touch with his time. I'd also like to say a few words on the connection between science and industry. He played an important part in terms of this société. He was also in this domestic industry support society. He was interested in the industry applications. So he served as president and then vice president of this society. It was created in 1801. The goal was to stimulate innovation and develop industry. It brought together industry players, scientists, manufacturers, scientific instrument manufacturers, administrators, etc. On the left-hand side, you see a list of society members, and there's also a vault manufacturer, a cobbler, a former notary public, a manufacturer of surgical instruments, and also Guess, who was a major designer of physics or electricity instruments at the time. And the picture shows the largest magneto-electric machine that was created in the middle of the 19th century and which was used to to the lighthouse in Le Havre. It was a place where people met, where they got together. The manufacturers, the industry players, the craftsmen, they all came together as part of this society designed to encourage domestic industry. So, what are the consequences? Not just Becquerel, but other physicists whose names we've already mentioned: Foucault, Fizeau, Victor Reynaud. All of these individuals were less prestigious physicists than the previous generation: Fresnel, Ampère, Laplace, Fournier, but they were all experimenters. These physicists all designed highly accurate instruments using thorough methodologies. The goal was to explore physical phenomena. And as a result, the precision industry in France was very successful in the 19th century. Let me give you an example regarding precision of the galvanometer used by Becquerel for his actinometer. This was discovered in 1839. The coil was wrapped up on each other 24,000 times by hand, just to give you an idea the level of accuracy provided by such instruments. And the picture shows you the Carpentier studio. Jules Carpentier replaced him in 1881. The Paris World Expo looked at electricity at the time, and Carpentier was also the successor of Rumkov. So French scientific and precision instruments are found in all university collections across the world, whether in the US or Australia, across the world. In all major universities and all major engineering schools, you find French-made instruments by Rumkov, Carpentier, etc. So strong ties between French experimental physics and applied physics and industry. And that is thanks to this generation of physicists in the middle of the 19th century. And except for maybe the Foucault pendulum, we have forgotten about them and their designs. There wasn't much attention left for Becquerel. Edmond Becquerel was also an electricity historian. Together with his father, he wrote a summary of the history of electricity and magnetism, which is really interesting and very well designed. And this is a reprint, and you can find it on Amazon.com. And this brings me to my conclusion. Via Becquerel, I believe it is possible to re-evaluate experimental and applied physics as opposed to theoretical physics, as I said before. The previous generation, Ampère, Laplace, Fresnel, Fourier, left their mark on mathematical theories. This is what they're known for. This was a triumph of mathematical physics, but you had to wait until the next generation, Langevin, Pierre Duhem, the Curies, to find a generation of French physicists who left their mark internationally in history. But this intermediate generation has been forgotten, and I think it's time we brought them back into the light and reevaluate them on the basis of their successes, which are different in nature than theory. So, what about forgotten or unexplained phenomena? I refer to two of these phenomena, but let's remember Antoine César, Becquerel Sr., who emphasized what he called pressure based electricity. This is found in all electricity treatises in the 19th century, but it's completely gone from electricity in the 20th century. Usually, these are phenomena that has to do with solid state physics, surface phenomena, which are complex phenomena that are based on quantum mechanics, and at the time, obviously, these phenomena cannot be explained. Throughout the day, we will understand better why it's important and interesting to replicate these scientific experiments. So, a strong connection between science and industry in the lab. You have physicists and researchers working together on industrial challenges, so the two go hand in hand. And lastly, I think we can safely call Becquerel the founding father of photovoltaics. That is why we're here today, isn't it? And this is the type of mention you find on a regular basis. But in the 80s, it wasn't. You did not find this anywhere in print or even online. Thank you very much for your attention. Just checking, says Mr. Lavédrine, just checking that my microphone is on. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation and for putting things back into perspective in terms of Becquerel's work. Um, he is enjoying growing recognition online in particular. We see this when people talk about him, and this is obviously a reason to rejoice. You talked about the society seeking to encourage domestic industry. We will hear a number of speakers, but we will also watch a number of videos which are available on demand. And specific videos will look at specific aspects of Becquerel's life and work. In particular, there's going to be a video on the Société d'encouragement that domestic industries support society. We have one question, but I would like to remind the listeners that they get to ask questions using the Q&R function of Zoom. The speaker will provide answers to those questions right after their speech or in the course of the Q&A session we are planning to hold at the end of the morning session. I think we have time for just one question. I have a question. I'm trying to get my hands on it. Here you go. It's a rather simple question. This community of experimenters, you refer to Foucault and his famous pendulum, you refer to Physio, another physicist. What about the relationships between this young community of physicists and experimenters who really marked the 19th century? What about the relationship between this community and Edmond Becquerel. To what extent did they collaborate? Was he one of them, or was he stuck in the museum working under his father's thumb? No, of course not. He did get out of the museum at times. As early as 1839, he was in contact with Arago. His father had close ties with Arago and Ampère. So he was in touch with the rest of the community of physicists. They got together when they every Friday at the Academy of Science after he was elected there. The Academy of Science was another place where they could congregate. Not at all. He wasn't an outcast at all. He wasn't isolated. Now, this community at the time was very different than what it is today. It was just a handful of people. There was maybe a dozen or so physics teaching positions. Well, maybe a few more if you include the preparatory schools. But this was a very small community, so it was easier for them to get together. And they all lived in the same place, in the center of Paris. And they also met when they discussed applications with instrument manufacturers. These studios where instruments were being made was also a place where physicists could get together with each other, but also with the manufacturer that was meant to make the instruments that they needed. Thank you very much. I'm sure we will have other questions. Handing over now to my colleague.
So I'm going to follow on now. Thank you very much for